Earlier today, in an experimental blog post called Riot Pls, the company addressed several different things that the community's been asking for a while, and that Riot to date has had a bit of radio silence on. And among those different things, they actually talked about Sandbox mode, which is, for those that don't know, a feature or mode that's been long requested by the community and also pro players and the whole esports scene, which would basically allow people and fans and players of the game to access this mode where they can do different things that you don't normally have to do, or that you normally don't have access to in the regular game. So for instance, you could set no cooldowns on different abilities to practice flash. You could level everybody on your team up to level 16, and this is actually something that I talked to Mark Zimmerman about, Team Liquid analyst and coach, a while back, and so this is something that I'm very interested in. Now, the community has had a very immediate and angry reaction to the whole thing, and before I really launch into why I think Riot's making a bad mistake, I want to point out that everybody's been asking for Riot to explain their reasoning behind not doing things or why certain modes and features aren't coming yet, and for the first time in quite some time, they're actually doing that. And so I think it's really important that we have a reasonable discourse about the whole thing, rather than just saying things like, their explanation is a pile of horseshit, which is something that I saw earlier today. And ultimately, there's just been a lot of really strong, angry reactions. And so I think it's important to note that they're actually having the conversation with us now. And if we don't have kind of this explosive reaction where we look like unreasonable people, they'll probably continue to do so in the future, which is probably good for everybody. Because then again, we can have these types of conversations. Anyway, let's go ahead and hop into their whole argument for this, right? So their main thing is that they feel as though players want sandbox mode for two reasons. The first being that they want to test out new content. Players want to test out new skins, new champions, etc. before purchasing them, and that Riot feels like this is a good idea. This is something that we've seen in Heroes of the Storm. One of the things that I think is a great thing that Riot could pick up from them is that whenever a new hero comes out, you can actually just load into a custom game and play it against bots and regular stuff, just get a feel for the character. And Riot agrees with this, and they're looking for ways to do this that don't involve the sandbox mode. The second reason is that because they sort of want, or they feel as though players want a way to test out different abilities in different situations without the constraints of the game. Riot wants players to feel as though League of Legends, playing a regular game of League of Legends, is the best way to level up and get better at League of Legends. And they also don't want this thing that they've coined to be called sandbox grinding. They don't want players to feel as though they have to grind in sandbox mode to get better. Now, I can certainly understand the reasoning for this, right? Because there are a lot of games, I think a lot of people can relate to this if you've played WoW, for instance, where you start playing the game and you don't really have to worry about different things because you can just level up and you're not spending too much time worrying about numbers and statistics and spreadsheets and all that kind of stuff. At the end of the game, you end up doing this rating stuff, and if you're really hardcore about it, you actually have to start loading up spreadsheets where you put in different gear to figure out what's the best mastery or the best stat or whatever to get on your gear, or what the best gem is. And I think that's what they want to avoid here, is this idea that you don't get better by playing the game, you get better by doing something else, right? Well, there's a couple problems with it. So first off, I mentioned two reasons why players and fans want sandbox mode. Those are the reasons that Riot mentioned. The problem is that they're actually missing one, which is the competitive play, and we'll get into that in a second. But first, let's address their second reason, because that's their big holdup for not wanting to do this, right? Is this idea that there's sandbox grinding and that they don't want people to feel like they should be doing something else rather than playing League of Legends to get better. Now, the problem here is that this whole idea that you just get better at League of Legends by playing League of Legends, or it's the best way to get better, is kind of limited. You can look at guides. Guides are something that have existed for a really long time. And this kind of helps you figure out how to do builds and all that kind of stuff. And what's really important to note about guides is that guides help you deal with systems that Riot has put in place that are already outside of the League of Legends game. Riot has masteries and runes. These are two systems that exist outside of League of Legends, the game. You choose these before you get in, and they require research and knowledge and an understanding in order to improve your gameplay and improve your ability to succeed in the game. This is really interesting to note, right? Because this actually kind of flies in the face of Riot's whole argument that they want you to get better just by playing the game. So you can't kind of make the argument, if you're Riot, that you don't want people to go outside of the game, because you actually have systems in place that require people to go outside of the game to figure out how to get better, that kind of thing. Now, my next point is that a pseudo bad version of the sandbox already exists in custom games. So a lot of people don't know this. I think he's talked about it publicly before, but Doublelift, whenever he was trying to learn how to get very good at AD carrying, he's told me this before, is that for a long time before he got into games or at a tournament or something like that, he would spend a lot of time literally just going into a custom game and practicing last hitting. And he would last hit up until 100, and I think only try to miss like a couple or try to go for flawless or something like that just to get better at last hitting. And people actually do go into these custom games right now to get a sense of, how an ability works or something along those lines. So this already exists. It's just poorly provided. This tool of testing things out in a game or a mode that's not a regular game already exists. It's just not very well built, one could argue, because people are already doing this. Now, the final way that I want to address their second point is by talking about sandbox grinding. They use this term, and they don't really elaborate on it too much, but I guess the whole idea is that instead of getting better at League of Legends by playing the game, you would have to go grind time or situations out in the sandbox mode. And I just kind of feel like this is a myth. Now, certainly you can point to the Doublelift thing that I just said about doing this AD carry, like last hitting thing or whatever. And yeah, that would be kind of an example of grinding. But grinding, generally speaking, in the gaming community is used to describe situations where you're just going in to level up. Like grinding in an MMO would be just sitting around doing this questing or something like that, or killing mobs. Sandbox mode already exists in several different games that are somewhat similar to League of Legends. You could argue that there's a lot of custom maps that you can use in StarCraft 2 that allow for this sandbox mode where you can try out a bunch of different things. And quite frankly, the whole map editor in StarCraft 2 is kind of like a sandbox mode where you can build different scenarios and that kind of thing. It's just a little bit more intense. Dota 2 also has similar tools that allow you to do this. And quite frankly, there's just not really, that I can think of, examples where a whole game like League of Legends or StarCraft 2 or any of these kind of MOBA RTS style games require going into a sandbox mode and just doing something. Normally speaking, it's just for a very niche situation. And that again, this kind of goes back to what I was saying before, is that yeah, you can use the sandbox mode to improve on little things in the same way that you can use a guide to improve on masteries or runes, but it's never going to be a situation where it's like, well, I can't play League of Legends right now, the game, because I need to go grind out some stuff in sandbox mode. That just doesn't really exist. As I mentioned earlier, there's actually a third reason why players and fans want the sandbox mode that Riot failed to address completely. And it's actually really disappointing that they didn't address it. I'd love to see them comment on this. And this is the competitive aspect of League of Legends. There's a whole esports ecosystem. Maybe you've heard about it: LCS, LPL, LCK, Worlds, etc. And there's all these different teams and players competing. And quite frankly, their reaction to this was probably really telling at how strongly valued a sandbox mode would be. And again, I just want to show a little bit of the conversation, this interview that I did with Mark Zimmerman, who's the coach analyst for TL. You guys can go back and watch that on GameSpot.com if you're interested in the full-length thing. But he kind of breaks down some of the value of it.
If you identify a weakness in your team, let's say Baron control, and then you say, all right, this week, guys, we're going to focus on like Baron control and focusing on that. But a lot of Barons, especially in scrims, just come off kills. And it's not really like a controlled situation the way it'll happen in the LCS. And so you'll have, 2 scrim blocks a week, or 2 scrim blocks a day, 4 days of practice, 4 or 5 days of practice. You're looking at maybe like anywhere from like 30 to 50 games throughout the week. And you might get into like 3 Baron situations, which really isn't that much practice. Yeah. Whereas if you could set that up through predetermined like settings in a game client or something, you could get into that situation right away as long as the other team was willing to practice that situation with you.
Now let's step a little bit back, because I think a lot of people might point out that there are only so many players and only so many teams, and that these competitive players and competitive teams actually represent a very small percentage of the League of Legends player base, and that the whole idea of implementing a sandbox mode around them would be maybe just not worth it, right? Because it's just a small segment. I think it's probably safe to say, roughly speaking, again, we're just going off of general estimates, that across the world, maybe on average, 1 million people watch people play League of Legends a day. That doesn't seem that hard to imagine whenever you're seeing LCS hit 100 and 200,000 numbers and people are going in and out of it, right? So maybe like 1 million people unique, and I think that's actually probably a conservative estimate against all the different regions. And what's important to note is that these are actually players and fans of League of Legends as well, and that these people very frequently log in and play games. This is kind of the whole value of the esports ecosystem for Riot, and the reason why they do LCS is that this is a cool thing that they're presenting their fans with. And this is why it's really important to have systems and to have designers and engineers that are actually spending time supporting these players and this whole ecosystem, because Riot is very clear about this idea that they want League of Legends to be considered a sport. And it's very important that they provide then the correct tools and opportunities for their players and their teams to improve and grow. And that's really why I think that it's short-sighted to put the statement out, and why their reasoning should probably be clarified at the very least if they're not planning on putting out this mode anytime soon. Anyway, thanks for watching. You can check out the rest of our coverage of all things League of Legends at gamespot.com/LOL.